The church bells were still echoing from my son's wedding when I got the call that would change everything. I stood in the empty reception hall, the last of the confetti swept into corners, the scent of roses and champagne lingering in the air, and listened as my father's lawyer explained that the estate had finally cleared probate. "You're the sole heir, John," he said, his voice steady and almost reverent. $12 million, all yours. I stared at the phone, the check burning a hole in my pocket, and felt a strange mix of grief, gratitude, and disbelief. My father had always been a quiet man, a farmer who built his fortune in silence, never boasting, never letting on just how much he'd managed to save. I thought of the long nights we'd spent together in the fields, the lessons he'd taught me about patience, dignity, and the value of keeping your cards close. I knew, in that moment, that I would honor his memory by doing the same. I watched the newlyweds, my son, Mark, and his new wife, Brittany, dance beneath the twinkling lights, their faces flushed with happiness and the promise of a future they thought was theirs to shape. I smiled, clapped, and said nothing about the inheritance. If you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. As the party faded and the guests drifted home, I realized that sometimes, silence is the best protection. I kept the check hidden, told no one, not even Mark. The next week, Brittany's true colors began to show. She redecorated their home with money she didn't have, planned expensive vacations, and started hinting at family investments. I saw the way she looked at me, calculating, always watching, as if she was waiting for me to slip up. Mark, blinded by love, dismissed my concerns. "Brittany just wants what's best for the family, Dad. Why are you being so stubborn?" I bit my tongue, remembering my father's advice, "Trust is earned, not given." I watched as Brittany's ambition grew, her charm turning to pressure, her smiles to demands. Barely a week after the honeymoon, she showed up at my door with a lawyer in tow. "We'd like you to sign over the house and any assets you have," she said, her smile brittle. "It's only fair that the family wealth stays in the family." Mark stood behind her, silent, his eyes pleading with me not to make a scene. I smiled politely, thanked them for their concern, and told them I'd think about it. That night, I called my lawyer and set up a trust, locking down every cent of the inheritance. I changed my will, updated my accounts, and made sure that nothing could be touched without my explicit consent. As I sat in the quiet of my study, the check still hidden in my desk, I realized that the real test was just beginning. Brittany thought she could outsmart me, that she could bully her way into a fortune she hadn't earned. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I woke to a new world, one where every smile was a threat, every conversation a negotiation, and every day brought me closer to the moment when Brittany would learn the truth. And when that day came, I promised myself I would be ready. The days that followed Brittany's first demand were a masterclass in manipulation. She began dropping by unannounced, always with a smile that never reached her eyes, her arms full of expensive gifts, bottles of wine, designer scarves, a new watch she insisted would look so distinguished on you, John. She'd linger in the kitchen, offering to help with bills or suggesting she could streamline my finances. You know, Dad, it's a lot to manage at your age. Mark and I could take care of everything for you. You deserve to relax. Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes were sharp, always scanning the room for signs of weakness. Mark called more often, his voice growing more insistent with each conversation. Brittany just wants what's best for the family, Dad. Why are you being so stubborn? Why can't you trust us? I listened, my heart aching for the boy I'd raised, the son who used to run to me with scraped knees and wild stories, now caught in the web of a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle. I remembered my father's words, "Trust is earned, not given," and held my ground. I let Brittany talk, let her think she was winning, all the while working with my lawyer to tighten the trust, to ensure that every cent of the inheritance was protected. I changed passwords, moved accounts, and made sure that nothing could be touched without my explicit consent. The pressure mounted. Brittany started showing up with Mark, her arm looped through his, her voice low and urgent. "We're family, John. Don't you want to see us happy? Don't you want to be part of our future?" I smiled, nodded, and told them I'd think about it. But inside, I was building walls, setting traps, and waiting for the moment when Brittany would overplay her hand. The tension in the house grew thick, every meal a negotiation, every conversation a test. I watched as Mark's confidence eroded, his love for Brittany warring with his loyalty to me. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes flickering with guilt and confusion. I wanted to reach out, to pull him back, but I knew he had to see the truth for himself. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, Brittany cornered me in the hallway, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you don't sign over the assets, I'll make sure you never see your grandchildren." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. I looked her in the eye, my voice steady. "You're making a mistake, Brittany. You have no idea who you're dealing with." She laughed, a brittle sound, and walked away, certain she'd won. But as I watched her go, I felt a surge of resolve. The game was on, and I was done playing by her rules. The next morning, I called my lawyer and set the final pieces in motion. Brittany thought she could bully her way into a fortune, but she was about to learn that the quietest man in the room is often the most dangerous. The storm was coming, and I was ready. The tension in the house was a living thing, coiling tighter with every passing day. Brittany's charm had curdled into open hostility, her visits now marked by icy stares and veiled threats. Mark, caught in the crossfire, grew more withdrawn, his phone calls shorter, his laughter gone. I watched the two of them circle each other, their marriage already showing cracks beneath the weight of Brittany's ambition. I kept my own counsel, never rising to her bait, never giving her the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Instead, I worked quietly with my lawyer, Carter, a man whose calm was as unyielding as steel. We met in his office late one evening, the city lights flickering outside as he slid a stack of documents across the desk. "It's all here, John. The trust is ironclad. The will is updated. Every account is locked down. If Brittany tries anything, she'll hit a wall." I nodded, relief and gratitude mingling in my chest. She's getting desperate, Carter. She threatened to keep my grandkids from me if I didn't sign. Carter's eyes hardened. Let her try. The law is on your side now. We set a trap. I invited Brittany and her lawyer to a meeting, pretending to consider their offer. I let them believe I was wavering, that I might finally give in. The day of the meeting, Brittany arrived in a storm of perfume and self-assurance, her lawyer trailing behind with a briefcase full of papers. "We're so glad you've come to your senses, John," she purred, sliding the documents across the table. "Just sign here, and we can all move forward as a family." I smiled, picked up the pen, and paused. "Before I sign, I'd like my lawyer to review these." Carter stepped forward, his voice calm but deadly. "Actually, we have a few documents of our own." He laid out the trust, the will, the account statements, and the legal protections I'd put in place. Mr. Miller's assets are untouchable. Any attempt to coerce or defraud him will be met with immediate legal action. Brittany's face went from smug to furious in seconds. "You can't do this. You're just an old man. No one will believe you." Carter smiled, unflinching. "The courts will. And so will the press, if you push this any further." Her lawyer paled, gathering the papers in a hurry. "We'll be in touch," he muttered, but Brittany was already on her feet, her voice rising. "You'll regret this, John. You'll die alone." I watched her storm out, the door slamming behind her, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The trap had sprung, and for the first time, I was no longer the one being hunted. Mark lingered in the doorway, his face a mask of shame and confusion. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know." I put a hand on his shoulder, my voice gentle. "You don't have to choose, son. But you do have to see the truth." That night, as I sat in the quiet of my study, I realized that the real battle was not for money, but for dignity, and that I was finally winning. The days after the failed meeting were a storm of slammed doors, angry voicemails, and icy silences. Brittany's fury was volcanic. She called at all hours, her messages swinging from pleading to threatening, her voice cracking with rage. "You're ruining everything, John. You're destroying this family." Mark, caught in the middle, began to unravel. He stopped coming by the house, his texts grew shorter, and when I finally saw him at the grocery store, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Dad, I don't know what to do," he whispered, his eyes red. "She says you're hiding money, that you never trusted us. She's talking about divorce." I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight of years between us. "Mark, I love you. But you have to see her for who she is. This isn't about money, it's about control." He nodded, but I could see the war in his heart. That night, as I sat in my study, the phone rang again. This time, it was Carter. "John, you need to come to the office. Now." His voice was urgent, and when I arrived, he handed me a thick envelope. "We got a tip from an anonymous source. It's about your father's estate." Inside were copies of old letters, bank statements, and a will, one I'd never seen before. My father had left a second trust, one that named Mark as a beneficiary, but only if he met certain conditions: finish college, stay out of legal trouble, and, most shocking of all, never coerce or manipulate family for financial gain. Carter's eyes were wide. This changes everything. If Brittany pushes for divorce, she'll never see a cent. And if Mark stands with you, he'll inherit more than he ever dreamed. The revelation hit me like a wave. My father, always the quiet strategist, had seen the dangers of greed and ambition long before I had. He'd built a safety net not just for me, but for Mark, a way to protect the family from itself. I felt a surge of gratitude, but also a new sense of responsibility. I called Mark, asking him to come over. When he arrived, I showed him the documents, watching as the truth dawned in his eyes. "She never loved me, did she?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "She loved what I could give her." I hugged him, my own tears falling. "You're my son. That's all that matters. But you have to choose, her, or the family your grandfather built." Mark nodded, his jaw set. "I choose us, Dad. I choose you." As the sun rose over the farm, I realized that the real inheritance was not money, but the courage to stand together, to face the truth, and to build something better from the ashes of betrayal. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I believed we could win, not just the lawsuit, but our family's future. Brittany's desperation became a storm that swept through every corner of our lives. She stopped pretending, her calls now openly threatening, her social media filled with cryptic posts about betrayal and greedy old men. Mark moved back into the farmhouse, his face drawn but his resolve hardening with every day that passed. We spent our evenings at the kitchen table, reviewing Carter's latest legal updates, the old trust documents, and the growing stack of evidence against Brittany and her family. The farm became a fortress, neighbors dropping by with casseroles and quiet words of support, the community rallying around us in a way I hadn't seen since my father's funeral. But beneath the surface, I could feel the tension building, the sense that Brittany was planning something reckless. It came to a head one rainy afternoon when a sheriff's cruiser pulled up the drive. The deputy handed me a summons. Brittany was suing for emotional distress, claiming I'd intentionally sabotaged her marriage and deprived her of her rightful inheritance. The lawsuit was laughable, but the timing was not. The court date was set for 2 weeks later, and the local press caught wind of the story, splashing our family drama across the front page. Farm fortune feud, daughter-in-law sues over secret millions. I could feel the eyes of the town on me everywhere I went, some sympathetic, others hungry for gossip. Mark was furious, but I told him to stay calm. "This is her last move, son. She's hoping we'll panic, that we'll settle just to make it go away. But we have the truth, and your grandfather's trust, on our side." Carter and Evelyn worked around the clock, preparing a counterclaim and gathering statements from neighbors, friends, and even former employees of Brittany's family who had seen her true colors. The night before the hearing, Mark and I sat on the porch, the rain drumming on the roof, the air thick with anticipation. "Are you scared, Dad?" he asked quietly. I thought about it, then shook my head. "Not anymore. I've already lost everything I was afraid to lose. Now I'm fighting for what matters, our dignity, our future, and the legacy your grandfather left us." Mark nodded, his eyes shining with pride. We'll face her together." As the storm raged outside, I realized that the real battle was not for money, but for the soul of our family. Brittany could take her best shot, but we were ready. The next day, as we walked into the courthouse, the world watching, I felt a calm settle over me. The final move was hers, but the endgame was ours to win. The courthouse was packed, the air thick with anticipation and the low buzz of whispered speculation as the judge called the room to order. Brittany sat at the plaintiff's table, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Mark and I sat side by side, Carter and Evelyn flanking us, the trust documents and evidence stacked neatly in front of us. The first hours were a blur of testimony, Brittany's lawyer painting her as a victim, a loving wife betrayed by a greedy father-in-law. She wept on the stand, describing sleepless nights and the pain of being denied her rightful place in the family. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes as Carter began his cross-examination. "Mrs. Miller, can you explain these emails?" Carter asked, projecting a series of messages onto the courtroom screen. The words were damning: Brittany's own plans to sell the farm, her instructions to her lawyer to push the old man out, her threats to Mark if he didn't support her. The room grew tense, the gallery leaning forward as Carter pressed on. "And can you explain this bank account, opened in your maiden name, just days after the wedding?" Brittany stammered, her composure slipping. "It was for emergencies. Mark knew about it." Mark shook his head, his voice steady. "No, I didn't." The judge's eyes narrowed. Then Carter called the surprise witness, Lila, a former assistant to Brittany's family, who had come forward after reading about the case in the paper. Lila took the stand, her hands trembling but her voice clear. "I was asked to forge signatures, to shred documents, to deliver envelopes of cash to city officials. I kept copies of everything." She handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The evidence was overwhelming: emails, bank transfers, even a recording of Brittany laughing about how easy it was to get the old man out. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the documents, his face growing grimmer with each page. Brittany's lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him off. "This evidence is admissible. Continue, Ms. Grant." Lila's testimony was devastating, her courage breaking the last of Brittany's composure. The gallery erupted in whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, the tide of the trial turning in an instant. Mark squeezed my hand, his eyes shining with hope and relief. "We've got her, Dad," he whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding with a mix of vindication and sorrow. I looked at Brittany, her mask of arrogance shattered, her future unraveling before her eyes. The judge called a recess, his voice stern. "We will reconvene tomorrow. I expect both sides to be prepared for closing arguments." As the courtroom emptied, I hugged Lila, gratitude and pride mingling in my chest. "You saved us," I whispered. She shook her head. "You saved yourself. I just told the truth." That night, as I walked the fields under a sky full of stars, I realized that the battle was almost over. The truth was out, the lies exposed, and for the first time, I believed that justice was within reach. But I also knew that the final verdict would test not just the law, but the strength of our family and the meaning of forgiveness. The morning of closing arguments dawned with a heavy sky, the courthouse steps slick with rain as John and Mark arrived, their nerves taut with anticipation. The gallery was packed, the air thick with the scent of wet coats and the low hum of reporters whispering about the family feud of the decade. Brittany sat at the plaintiff's table, her face pale and drawn, her lawyer rifling through papers with frantic energy. But it was her father who drew every eye as he stood, his presence commanding, his voice booming as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal. The so-called evidence was obtained through coercion and illegal surveillance. My daughter is the true victim here, her reputation destroyed by a campaign of lies and manipulation." The judge's eyes narrowed, his patience clearly wearing thin. Carter rose, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Your Honor, every document, every recording, every witness was obtained legally. The only manipulation here is the one orchestrated by the plaintiff's family." The judge nodded, motioning for Carter to continue. "We have one final piece of evidence," Carter said, holding up a flash drive. "A recording of Mr. Grant, Brittany's father, offering a bribe to a county official in exchange for fast-tracking the farm's sale." The courtroom erupted in gasps as the audio played, Mr. Grant's voice, unmistakable, promising a generous donation if the deed could be transferred without John's consent. The judge's face darkened. "Mr. Grant, do you have anything to say?" For the first time, the CEO's confidence faltered. He looked at Brittany, then at the judge, and finally at John. I was trying to protect my family. I made a mistake." The gallery was silent, the power dynamic shifting in an instant. John stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I have nothing to add. The evidence speaks for itself. I only ask for justice, for my family, for my son, and for the truth." The judge nodded, his respect for John clear. As the lawyers made their closing arguments, the tension in the room was electric. Carter spoke of legacy, of the value of hard work and honesty, of the courage it took to stand up to power. Brittany's lawyer tried to sow doubt, but the jury's faces were set, their minds made up. As the judge dismissed the court for deliberation, John sat with Mark and Evelyn, the three of them united by the battle they had fought together. "No matter what happens," Mark said quietly, "I'm proud of you, Dad." John smiled, his heart full. "I'm proud of us, son. We did this together." The hours dragged on, the courthouse a hive of nervous energy. When the jury finally returned, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on the foreman as he read the verdict. John held his breath, knowing that whatever happened next, he had already won the most important battle, the battle for his dignity, his family, and the legacy he would leave behind. The jury's return was met with a hush so deep it seemed to swallow the entire courtroom. John sat with Mark and Evelyn, his hands folded tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. Brittany's family was a portrait of defeat, her mother's eyes red from crying, her father's jaw clenched, Brittany herself trembling, her gaze fixed on the floor. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and read the verdict. "We find in favor of the defendant, John Miller, on all counts. Damages awarded, $12 million, plus legal fees." The words seemed to hang in the air, unreal, as the judge thanked the jury and banged his gavel. For a moment, no one moved. Then, as the gallery erupted in whispers and the reporters surged forward, Brittany's father did something no one expected. He stood, walked across the courtroom, and bowed deeply to John. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking, the words barely more than a whisper. "I was wrong." The room went silent, the shock of humility from a man who had never admitted fault before more powerful than any verdict. Brittany's face turned ashen, her arrogance dissolving into tears. Mark wept openly, the realization of what had been lost and what had been saved crashing over him. John stood, his own eyes wet, and offered his hand. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said quietly. The CEO took it, his grip trembling, and for a moment, the years of bitterness and betrayal seemed to fade. The judge called for order, but the room was already shifting, the power dynamic forever changed. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, their cameras flashing, but John barely noticed. He hugged Mark, Evelyn, and even Lila, the whistleblower who had risked everything to tell the truth. As they left the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, the city bathed in golden light. John felt a peace settle over him, the kind that comes from knowing you have stood your ground, spoken your truth, and changed the course of your family's story. The CEO's bow was more than an apology, it was a recognition of dignity, a surrender to justice, and a promise that the past would not be repeated. That night, as John sat on the porch of the farm, the field stretching out before him, he realized that the greatest victory was not the money, but the respect he had finally earned. The journey was not over, but the hardest part was behind him. The family would never be the same, but for the first time, John believed that healing was possible. The world had seen his strength, and so had he. The drive home from the courthouse was a journey through memory and possibility, the city's noise fading behind John as the fields opened up before him, golden in the late afternoon sun. Mark rode beside him, silent at first, the weight of the verdict and the CEO's bow still settling in. The radio played quietly, a song about forgiveness and home, and John found himself humming along, the tension in his chest finally beginning to ease. When they pulled into the driveway, neighbors were waiting, some with casseroles, others with handshakes and hugs, all eager to welcome John back as more than just a survivor, but as a man who had stood up for himself and for the land that had shaped him. The farm felt different now, every fence post and row of corn a testament to resilience, every barn beam a reminder that dignity could be rebuilt, one honest day at a time. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark and John sat on the porch, watching the sky turn from gold to indigo. "I'm sorry, Dad," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "For not believing you. For letting them turn me against you." John put a hand on his son's shoulder, his own eyes wet. "We all make mistakes, son. What matters is what we do next." They talked late into the night, sharing stories, laughter, and the kind of honest conversation that had been missing for years. The next morning, John met with Carter and Evelyn to discuss the future. The $12 million verdict was more than a victory, it was a responsibility. John decided to donate a portion to mental health charities, turning Vanessa's cruel words into a legacy of hope for others. He set up a scholarship fund for local students, invested in new equipment for the farm, and started a mentorship program for young farmers. The community rallied around him, their respect for his strength and generosity growing with each new project. Even those who had once doubted him now saw him as a leader, a man who had faced down power and won. As the weeks passed, John found peace in the rhythms of the land, planting, harvesting, teaching Mark the old ways and learning new ones together. The pain of the past lingered, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he chose to remember the lessons learned, that dignity is worth fighting for, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that family, at its best, is a place where even the deepest wounds can be healed. As the farm flourished and the community thrived, John realized that the greatest revenge was not in payback, but in living well, loving deeply, and leaving the world better than he'd found it. The farm was alive with the sounds of summer, cicadas buzzing in the tall grass, the distant laughter of children playing by the pond, the steady rhythm of work and hope restored. John had settled into a new kind of peace, his days filled with purpose and the quiet satisfaction of seeing the land and his family heal. Mark had become his right hand, their bond stronger than ever, and the community's respect was no longer tinged with pity but with genuine admiration. Then, one afternoon, as John was sorting through the mail on the porch, he found a letter addressed in a familiar, elegant hand. It was from Brittany. He hesitated, the old ache in his chest flaring, but Mark, seeing the envelope, nodded. "You should read it, Dad. Whatever it says, we'll face it together." John opened the letter, his hand steady despite the memories. Brittany's words were raw, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined her. "John, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I know I hurt you and Mark, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. I am in therapy now, working to understand why I did what I did. I lost everything, but I see now that what I wanted was never the farm or the money, it was a sense of belonging, of being part of something real. I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours. Holding on to anger will only poison what you've built. I wish you both happiness and peace." John read the letter aloud, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Mark listened, his jaw clenched, tears shining in his eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive her, Dad." "Not yet." John put a hand on his son's shoulder, his own eyes wet. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, son. It's about letting go of the pain so it doesn't control you anymore. We don't have to let her back into our lives, but we can choose not to let her destroy what we've built." They sat together in the fading light, the letter between them, and made a silent pact to move forward, not as victims, but as survivors, as men who had faced the worst and come out stronger. That night, as John walked the fields under a sky full of stars, he felt the last ghost of the past begin to fade. The farm was safe, the family was healing, and the future, though still uncertain, was theirs to shape. The greatest revenge, he realized, was not in payback, but in the quiet, steady work of building a life worth living, one day at a time. The day of the farm's first community festival dawned with a sky so blue it seemed to promise a new beginning. John woke early, the air alive with the scent of fresh-cut hay and the distant sound of neighbors setting up tables and tents along the gravel drive. Mark was already outside, directing volunteers, his laughter ringing out as he helped children carry baskets of apples and jars of homemade jam. The barn, once a place of secrets and shame, was now strung with lights and bunting, the doors thrown open to welcome everyone who had stood by them through the storm. As the sun climbed higher, the fields filled with people, old friends, new faces, families who had come to see what hope looked like when it was planted and tended with care. John moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting hugs, and listening to stories of how the farm's transformation had inspired others to fight for their own families, their own dignity. The mayor gave a short speech, praising John and Mark for their courage and generosity, and presented them with a plaque, for turning pain into purpose, and for showing us all that forgiveness is the greatest harvest. As the afternoon wore on, music and laughter filled the air, children raced through the corn maze, and the smell of barbecue drifted from the grills. John found himself at the center of it all, his heart full as he watched Mark teach a group of teenagers how to plant seedlings, his own hand steady as he poured lemonade for a line of thirsty guests. Evelyn, Carter, and even Lila were there, their friendship now a permanent part of the farm's story. As dusk fell and the first stars appeared, John took the stage, the crowd growing quiet as he spoke. "This farm has seen its share of storms," he said, his voice steady. "But it's also seen the power of second chances. We've learned that family isn't just about blood or land. It's about the people who stand by you when things fall apart, and the courage to forgive when it would be easier to walk away." The applause was thunderous, and as the music started up again, John and Mark stood together at the edge of the field, the farm stretching out before them, safe and thriving. "We did it, Dad," Mark said quietly. "We really did." John put an arm around his son's shoulders, his heart overflowing with gratitude. "We did it together, son. And we'll keep doing it, one day at a time." The pain of the past would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined them. Instead, they chose to remember the lessons learned, that dignity is worth fighting for, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that the truest legacy is not land or money, but the courage to love, forgive, and begin again. As the last guests drifted home and the farm settled into quiet, John looked up at the stars and felt a peace deeper than any he had ever known. The journey had been long and hard, but in the end, it had led them all home. The morning after the festival, John Miller woke before dawn, the house still and quiet, the air tinged with the scent of wood smoke and dew. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, the grass cool beneath his feet, the sky just beginning to blush with the promise of sunrise. The farm stretched out before him, every fence mended, every field alive with the memory of laughter and music from the night before. He walked the familiar paths, his breath clouding in the crisp air, and paused at the edge of the pumpkin patch, watching as the first golden light spilled over the horizon. Mark joined him, a mug of coffee in hand, his face relaxed and open in a way John hadn't seen since he was a boy. They stood together in silence, father and son, the weight of the past months settling into something softer, no longer a burden, but a bond. "I used to think this place was a curse," Mark said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fields. "But now I see it's a gift. Thank you for not giving up on me, Dad." John smiled, his heart full. "We both had to learn the hard way, son. But we learned. And that's what matters." As the sun climbed higher, the farm came alive, chickens clucking, the distant rumble of a tractor, the laughter of children as they raced through the rows of corn. John felt a peace settle over him, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. He thought of Brittany's letter, of the pain and forgiveness that had brought them to this moment, and realized that the scars of the past were not something to hide, but to honor. They were proof of survival, of resilience, of the courage to begin again. Mark turned to him, his eyes shining. "What do we do now?" John looked out over the land, the legacy he'd fought so hard to protect, and felt the answer rise in his chest. "We live, son. We love. We keep building, together." As they walked back to the house, the sun warming their backs, John knew that the story of the Miller farm would be told for generations, not as a tale of betrayal, but as a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of family, and the quiet, unbreakable hope that no storm could ever wash away. The journey had been long and hard, but in the end, it had led them home. And as John closed the door behind him, the farm alive with the sounds of a new day, he knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and finally, at peace.